Snow fell over the village like a slow burial. Each flake seemed to hesitate before landing, as if deciding where another silence should rest. Dmitri Sokolov watched from the crooked window of his father's cottage, the violin resting against his shoulder. His fingers, calloused from years of harvesting rye, moved gently on the strings, coaxing a melody he had learned alone, half lullaby, half prayer. He was 24, with eyes the color of steel fog and skin carved by winter. The thin scar on his jaw spoke of a childhood accident with a plow, but his real wounds had no shape. They lived in the space between each note he played. Dmitri was a man of quiet resolve, a heart that still believed beauty could survive even here, where the wind cut deeper than any blade. Outside, the frost clung to the thatched roofs like pale moss. Chickens scratched under the snow for crumbs they would not find. The smell of burning birch seeped into the air, mixing with the faint tang of iron from the frozen well. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. 3 short tolls. Everyone knew what it meant. Orders had arrived. Dmitri set the violin down on the table beside a stack of worn sheet music, the ink smudged from years of handling. He stepped into his coat, feeling the stiff canvas resist at the elbows, and pulled on boots still marked with last season's mud. His mother stood by the door, her hands working the edge of her apron. She didn't speak. Her eyes, dark and brittle, searched his face as if memorizing it. The road to the village square was a thin vein through the snow. Horses snorted clouds into the air, their manes crusted with frost. Soldiers from other hamlets had already gathered, men in mismatched uniforms, some with sabers, others clutching rifles older than their fathers. The air carried the damp wool smell of unwashed coats and the metallic promise of steel. That was when he saw them, the 2 Cossack brothers. The older, about 35, stood with one boot resting on a crate, his mustache a russet curtain over a mouth set in a line that rarely bent. His skin was leathered from years under the open sky, his posture coiled like a man who had survived more than one ambush. The younger, perhaps 19, had hair pale as rye straw and eyes too eager for the weight of the rifle slung across his back. He kept glancing at his brother, waiting for cues, as if each movement should be approved before it happened. Near them, leaning against a sleigh runner, was a wounded officer. His uniform still bore the braid and tarnished medals of an elite regiment, though the left sleeve was torn and dark with old blood. His face, angular and pale, seemed carved from the same ice that lined the eaves. He watched the crowd with the patience of someone who knew pain would not kill him today, but might tomorrow. Dmitri felt the paper in his pocket, one of his compositions. He would take it with him. War, he thought, might have its own melody. Perhaps he would learn it. When the orders were read aloud, the maims came like stones dropped into water. Dmitri's was among them. He was to join the southern push toward East Prussia, where General Samsonov's army would advance against the Germans. The words tasted of frost and gunpowder in the back of his throat. By dusk, they began to move. Boots crushed the snow with the sound of breaking bones. The wind pressed cold fingers against Dmitri's neck, and every breath drew needles into his lungs. Behind him, the Cossack brothers muttered to each other in low tones, and somewhere ahead the officer coughed, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to carry across the whole column. The road out of the village wound through birch stands and frozen marsh. The sun had already fallen behind the horizon, leaving a smear of pale gold that bled quickly into ash. Dmitri kept his eyes on the tracks left by the man in front of him. Step after step, he thought of the violin in its case back home. He had not said goodbye to it properly. The night deepened, and with it came the first howls, distant, uncertain. Wolves, or perhaps only the wind shaping itself into warnings. Either way, Dmitri felt the world narrow to the crunch beneath his feet, the cold biting his fingers through the gloves, and the taste of fear, sharp and metallic, at the edge of every breath. The march grew heavier with each step, as if the snow itself conspired to hold them back. Dmitri's legs burned beneath the weight of wet wool and ice-crusted boots. The air was brittle. Every breath cracked in his chest. Frost formed along the tips of his lashes, and he could feel the sting of salt as it melted into his eyes. Somewhere ahead, the line slowed. Orders were passed down in sharp, breathless voices. The sound of distant artillery rumbled like a slow-moving storm, its echoes carried across the frozen plains. Dmitri could smell it before he truly heard it. The acrid tang of powder hanging low in the air. The front was not far. The Cossack brothers walked close now. The older, Mikhail, moved with the precision of a man who had learned long ago that unnecessary motion could mean death. His eyes scanned the tree line with a predator's patience. Beside him, the younger, Aleksei, shifted his rifle from one shoulder to the other, restless. His breath came fast, clouds of steam drifting behind him like ghosts unwilling to vanish. The officer limped several paces ahead, one hand pressed to his side. The dark stain on his coat had grown, spreading like a shadow that refused to fade. Still, he kept his back straight, his chin lifted against the wind. Dmitri wondered what rank could give a man such endurance, or if it was only pride. The column turned onto a narrow forest road where birch trunks stood like pale sentinels. Their branches clattered together above, dropping flecks of ice that stung on bare skin. The sound of marching boots muffled into the snow, and with it came a strange quiet, as though the forest were holding its breath. That was when the first shot cracked. It came from the right, sharp as a splinter. A man in front of Dmitri dropped without a sound, his rifle tumbling from stiff fingers. Before Dmitri could react, more shots followed, the air splitting with the dry snap of rifles and the deeper thud of machine guns. The forest erupted into chaos. "Ambush!" someone shouted, but the word was swallowed by the storm of gunfire. Men scattered, diving for the shallow ditches along the road. Dmitri threw himself behind a fallen trunk, his cheek pressed into the frozen bark. Splinters stung his face as bullets chewed into the wood. Mikhail's voice cut through the noise, low but firm, calling for Aleksei to stay close. The brothers moved like wolves, slipping from cover to cover, their movements quick and precise. The officer, though bleeding, barked clipped orders, pointing toward a gap in the tree line. Dmitri's heart hammered, not with courage, but with the raw instinct to survive. The snow seemed louder than the gunfire, each flake hissing against his coat. He tried to return fire, but the rifle felt alien in his hands, clumsy compared to the bow of his violin. Still, he pulled the trigger, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. A shell exploded somewhere to the left, showering us with dirt and ice. The blast punched the air from his lungs, leaving only a ringing in his ears. Through the haze, Dmitri saw men falling, some moving, others as still as the snow closed over them. The officer staggered toward him, shouting something Dmitri couldn't hear. Then, a sudden burst of machine gun fire cut the column in two. Dmitri found himself separated, the path back to the main group now a wall of lead and splintering wood. Mikhail appeared at his side, Aleksei close behind. The officer followed, his steps uneven but determined. They didn't speak. Words would waste breath. Together, they plunged into the deeper forest, away from the road, away from the killing ground. Behind them, the sound of battle faded into the distance, swallowed by the whisper of falling snow. The forest closed around them like a slow fist. The trees were thicker here, their trunks dark and wet, crowned with snow that sagged heavily over the branches. Every step broke the crust of ice beneath their boots, releasing the faint, stale scent of earth long trapped beneath the frost. The sound was loud in the stillness, and Dmitri kept glancing over his shoulder, certain someone, something was following. They moved without speaking. Breath became a currency they could not waste. The officer's limp had worsened. He leaned on Mikhail's shoulder now, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched. Aleksei ranged ahead, his youth still feeding him bursts of energy, though Dmitri noticed how often the boy's gaze darted toward the dark spaces between the trees. It was Aleksei who heard them first, the long, wavering howl that seemed to hang in the air. Wolves. The sound came from far off, yet the forest gave no sense of distance. It could have been a mile away. It could have been just beyond the next line of birches. Mikhail muttered something under his breath, a word Dmitri didn't catch but felt all the same. The air shifted. They were no longer just soldiers trying to return to Russian lines. They were prey. By midday, the snow had begun to fall again, fine, dry flakes that whispered as they landed. Dmitri's gloves were stiff with ice. When he flexed his fingers, they cracked like old parchment. He reached into his coat and felt the folded sheet music there, the paper already softening from the damp. That morning before the march, he had scribbled a few lines on the back, a letter to his mother, telling him he was alive. He did not know if she would ever read it. The officer spoke quietly to Mikhail, pointing toward a small rise ahead. It offered higher ground, perhaps a view of the land beyond the forest. They climbed slowly, the snow deepening with each step, the cold biting harder as the wind found them again. At the top, Dmitri could see far across the pale expanse. No smoke, no movement, just endless white. The emptiness pressed against him, heavy as the pack on his back. Then came another howl, closer now, answered by a second from somewhere behind. The pack was circling. They moved again, faster this time. Dmitri's breath tore at his throat, each inhale a blade. The officer stumbled, nearly falling, but Mikhail caught him under the arm. Aleksei kept glancing over his shoulder, his pale hair damp with sweat despite the cold. When the first wolf appeared, it was only a shadow between the trees. Then another and another, their shapes low and fluid, eyes catching what little light filtered through the clouds. They didn't rush. They followed, waiting. Dmitri felt the rifle heavy in his hands. He thought of the violin, how its weight was balanced, how every note demanded precision. This was different. Here, the wrong note could cost blood. The light began to fade. The snow turned to a fine mist, blurring the edges of everything. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of gunfire drifted, dull, far off. Russian lines, perhaps. Hope and danger in equal measure. They found a shallow hollow beneath a leaning pine. Mikhail said they would rest here for the night, his voice carrying the finality of a man who knew the forest's rules. They built a small fire, hidden from view, its smoke curling low under the branches. The warmth barely reached Dmitri's face, but it was enough to thaw the ache in his fingers. He took out the sheet music again. By the flicker of firelight, he wrote another line to his mother, then one to no one in particular, a melody in words. He imagined playing it, the sound rising through the cold until even the wolves would pause to listen. But outside the circle of firelight, their eyes glimmered in the dark. The wolves waited. So did the war. The fire had burned low, its embers sighing under the weight of ash. Outside the narrow shelter of the pine, the night pressed in, thick, black, alive. The wolves had gone quiet, but Dmitri knew they were still there, pacing somewhere beyond the reach of the light.
Silence, he thought, was only another kind of sound. Sleep came in broken fragments. Each time his eyes closed, the forest was replaced by another winter. 1 year before, when the snow was clean and harmless. He was 16, standing in the small wooden church at the heart of the village. The smell of beeswax candles and wet wool hung in the air. His violin rested under his chin, the bow gliding in time with the voices of the choir. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside there was only music, warm and whole. He remembered the faces, his mother at the back, her lips curved in the smallest of smiles. His father, arms folded, pretending to look stern, but failing. Music had been a bridge then, something that joined every soul in the room. Now, in the forest, it was only a thread he held in the dark, afraid it might snap. A sudden snap of a branch pulled him back. Aleksei stirred, hand closing on his rifle, but Mikhail's low whisper told him it was nothing, at least for now. The officer lay on his side, breathing shallow, the smell of dried blood sharp in the cold. Dmitri reached into his coat for the folded sheet music. The ink was blurred where melted snow had touched it, but the notes were still there, thin black shapes marching across the page like men on the road. On the back, his letters stretched in uneven lines. He traced them with a gloved finger, imagining each word finding its way home. By morning, the snow had stopped. The world was bright but hard, the air so cold it made his teeth ache. They moved slowly, the officer supported between Mikhail and Dmitri. The forest began to thin, revealing slopes of open ground. In the distance, a dark smear broke the white, a burned-out farmhouse, its roof sagging inward. As they approached, Dmitri's thoughts drifted again. He saw himself as a boy, sitting on the step of that same farmhouse years earlier, long before it was charred and hollow. A neighbor had lived there then, an old man with stories about battles fought before Dmitri was born. The man's voice had been rough, but when he spoke of the dead, it softened, as if each name carried weight. Dmitri had listened, the violin on his lap, wondering if war was always a song that ended too soon. The farmhouse now was silent. No wind moved through its broken frame. They found shelter in what remained of the barn, its walls leaning but still standing. The air inside smelled of old hay and smoke. Dmitri set the officer down gently and checked the wound. It was bad, but the man's eyes still held a steady light. That night, Dmitri played in his head. Every note was measured against the crunch of snow, the sigh of wind, the faint pad of paws outside. The melody had changed over the years, shaped by each loss, each silence. In the dark, it was both comfort and burden. He wondered if, should he survive, he would ever hear it the same way again. Dawn came pale and brittle, the sky the color of hammered lead. The wind had sharpened overnight, cutting through every seam in their clothes. Dmitri woke to the sound of Mikhail stirring the embers, his movements slow and deliberate. The officer was still alive, though his skin had taken on the waxy hue of winter's final claim. They moved before the sun cleared the horizon, the snow crunching underfoot like bones breaking under weight. Each breath left a ribbon of frost in the air. Dmitri carried the officer's rifle slung across his back. It was lighter than the man himself, whose weight dragged at his shoulder as they walked. The wolves had fallen silent. Whether they had given up or were merely waiting, Dmitri could not tell. The silence was heavier than their presence, a hollow space into which every footstep fell. By midday, the sound of distant artillery returned, faint, like thunder smothered by snow. Russian lines lay somewhere beyond the next ridge. Mikhail's pace quickened. Aleksei followed close,
his eyes fixed on the horizon. They were halfway up the slope when the shot came. Aleksei fell forward, the snow catching him as gently as a pillow. For a moment Dmitri thought he had only stumbled, but then he saw the dark bloom spreading beneath him. Mikhail dropped to his knees beside his brother, his voice breaking into something between a prayer and a curse. Dmitri turned toward the tree line. Shadows moved. German scouts, rifles ready. There was no time. Mikhail pressed his forehead to Aleksei's for a heartbeat, then rose, his face carved from grief. He said, "Go," though his eyes never left the body. Dmitri hesitated, but the officer's weight pulled at him, reality dragging him forward. He followed Mikhail's lead, zigzagging through the snow as bullets chased their heels. The ridge crested into open ground, and beyond it, faint shapes in long coats, Russian soldiers. Shouts rose. Friendly rifles answered the German fire. Dmitri stumbled the last few yards, half carrying, half dragging the officer into the arms of waiting medics. Behind him, Mikhail appeared, alone. The battlefield fell away into muffled quiet. Medics worked over the officer, their voices brisk but calm. Dmitri stood apart, watching the snow drift down. Each flake vanished into the white without a trace, as though nothing had happened here. He reached into his coat and pulled out the sheet music. On the back, among the smudged notes in cramped handwriting, he wrote one last line. Some songs end too soon. He didn't know if it was meant for his mother, for Mikhail, or for himself. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the guns spoke again. Dmitri listened for the melody in them, but heard only the silence between shots, the silence that would cover them all, sooner or later.